The year is 1914, and Europe is at war. The German Empire is advancing deep into France, their armies marching toward Paris with the belief that victory is just days away. The Allies have been forced into a desperate retreat, their forces battered, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse. But then, against all odds, the tide turns. A single battle will decide the fate of France, and perhaps the fate of the entire war. Welcome to ASMR War History, where we explore the most pivotal battles of history in a calm and immersive way. If you enjoy this content, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with future episodes. Now let us begin with an overview of the battle. The First Battle of the Marne, remembered in France as the Miracle on the Marne, unfolded between the 5th and 12th of September in the year 1914. It was a turning point in the opening months of the First World War, a battle that decided the fate of France and set the stage for the brutal years of conflict that would follow. The German army had entered France with a plan to win the war in 40 days, sweeping toward Paris with the goal of destroying both the French and British armies. Their early victories in August, including the battles of Mons and the frontiers, forced the Allies into a desperate retreat. The Germans advanced relentlessly, covering more than 250 kilometers southward, pushing the Franco-British forces toward the Marne River Valley. By early September, German troops were a mere 40 kilometers from Paris. As the German war machine pressed forward, British commander John French lost confidence in his French allies. He began considering a withdrawal to the port cities along the English Channel, preparing for a possible evacuation back to Britain. But the French commander, Joseph Joffre, remained steadfast. He reorganized his forces, integrating reserve units into the regular army and shifting reinforcements from the Eastern Front. By the 3rd of September, the military governor of Paris, Joseph Simon Gallieni, saw an opportunity. He realized that the German right flank was exposed, and he positioned his forces to strike. On the 4th of September, Joffre issued the order for a counteroffensive. The battle raged across the land between Paris and Verdun, stretching 230 kilometers from west to east. The heaviest fighting was concentrated in the western half of this vast front. By the 9th of September, the momentum had shifted. The Franco-British counterattack had placed the German 1st and 2nd armies in a precarious position, threatening to encircle them. German commanders had no choice but to order a retreat to the Aisne River. Pursued by the Allies, they withdrew over a distance of 65 kilometers before digging in along the heights north of the river. There they prepared for a new engagement, the First Battle of the Aisne. The German retreat marked the collapse of their attempt to conquer France in a swift and decisive blow. Instead, both sides scrambled to outflank each other in a desperate race to the north, an operation that would become known as the Race to the Sea. This manoeuvring would culminate in the First Battle of Ypres, and from there, the war would spiral into a grim and unrelenting stalemate, with trench warfare dominating the Western Front for the next 4 years. The cost of the battle was staggering. In just 7 days, an estimated 250,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded. The British suffered nearly 13,000 casualties. The German toll was even higher: 298,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Some have called the Battle of the Marne the most important land battle of the 20th century. Others argue that it was the most significant battle in all of history. To the French, it was nothing short of a miracle, a moment when all seemed lost, yet through sheer determination, they turned the tide. It was the battle that saved France. Now let's rewind a bit. Germany declared war on France on the 3rd of August 1914. Both sides believed the war would be short. Germany faced the daunting challenge of a two-front war, battling Russia in the east and France and Britain in the west. Their strategy relied on overwhelming speed. According to the Schlieffen Plan, as revised by Helmuth von Moltke, the Germans launched a sweeping offensive through Belgium into France, aiming to capture Paris and crush the French army in a matter of weeks. Their timetable allowed only 6 weeks to achieve victory before turning their attention to Russia. But in violating Belgium's neutrality, Germany triggered Britain's entry into the war, bringing the British Expeditionary Force into the fight. Germany deployed 7 armies to the Western Front, 3 of which would play critical roles in the Battle of the Marne. The First Army, initially numbering 320,000 men, was led by Alexander von Kluck. The Second Army, with 260,000, was commanded by Karl von Bülow. The Third Army, under Max von Hausen, had 180,000. However, by the time they reached the Marne, these numbers had been drastically reduced by the brutal fighting of the opening weeks. The French army, stationed along the Western Front, had 5 primary armies at the war's outbreak. Among them, the 4th Army under Fernand de Langley de Cary and the 5th Army under Charles Lanfransac would be most heavily engaged in the coming battle. As the German offensive gained momentum, France created 2 additional armies to counter the threat. The 6th Army under Joseph Gallieni, charged with protecting Paris, and the 9th Army under Ferdinand Foch. The French forces on the Marne swelled rapidly, reinforced by fresh recruits and transfers from other fronts. In just 2 weeks, the number of French divisions facing the Germans rose from 17 to 41, bringing their total strength to over 700,000. The British Expeditionary Force, initially composed of 130,000 highly trained soldiers, was commanded by Field Marshal John French. The British played a pivotal role in the battle, though their leader initially doubted France's ability to hold the line. The 2 supreme commanders embodied strikingly different leadership styles. German Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke remained in Luxembourg, issuing orders from afar and granting his generals broad discretion. Meanwhile, Joseph Joffre, the French commander, was in constant motion. Though famously committed to fine dining and 8 hours of sleep each night, he travelled tirelessly to rally his forces, visiting frontline commanders and removing any general who did not meet his expectations. More than 30 French generals were dismissed under his command. John French, the British commander, was far more cautious. Shocked by the high casualties suffered in earlier battles, he hesitated to commit his troops fully. However, as the situation at the Marne unfolded, his forces would prove vital in turning the tide. The strategic approaches of France and Germany could not have been more different. France had concentrated its defences in the east, expecting the Germans to strike there, and hoping to reclaim the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine. Their northern border with Belgium remained largely undefended to avoid accusations of violating Belgian neutrality, a concern that ultimately proved irrelevant when Germany ignored such restrictions and marched through Belgium regardless. For Germany, speed was everything. They knew that a prolonged war would favour the Allies, as Britain, France and Russia possessed greater resources and manpower. To stand a chance, Germany had to win quickly. The Schlieffen Plan was an all-or-nothing gamble, a bold and reckless bid to knock France out of the war before the full strength of the Allies could be brought to bear. Both France and Germany entered the war with the expectation of a swift victory. France's top priority was reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine, lost to Germany decades earlier. Germany, facing the prospect of a two-front war, sought to defeat France quickly before turning east to confront Russia. Both sides believed that offensive action would be decisive. The French military doctrine revolved around the the cult of the offensive, where courage and sheer willpower were seen as the keys to victory. But as the opening battles of August unfolded, a grim reality emerged. Artillery and machine guns shredded advancing troops before they could close the distance. A young French lieutenant named Charles de Gaulle would later remark that no amount of bravery could overcome the destructive power of modern firepower. August of 1914 saw devastating clashes across Belgium and northern France, nearly all of which ended in German victories. The Germans rapidly occupied most of Belgium and forced the British and French into a desperate retreat. While the French launched futile offensives in Alsace-Lorraine, believing the main German thrust was coming from the east, the true danger lay to the northwest. General Charles Lanrezac, commander of the French Fifth Army, repeatedly warned that the Germans were advancing through Belgium in overwhelming numbers. Retired General Joseph Gallieni also recognized the threat, but French High Command clung to outdated assumptions. It wasn't until the 24th of August that Joseph Joffre finally acknowledged the reality. He abandoned his initial strategy, Plan 17, and ordered his forces into a defensive posture. The Great Retreat began. French forces, alongside the British Expeditionary Force, withdrew over 300 kilometres, trying to maintain cohesion as they fell back under relentless pressure from the German 1st, 2nd and 3rd Armies. In the brutal heat of late summer, hundreds of thousands of men marched southward, burdened by heavy wool uniforms and 60-pound packs. The Germans, believing victory was imminent, pressed forward with determination. But their Chief of General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, saw warning signs. Despite their relentless advance, German forces were capturing few prisoners or enemy weapons, suggesting that the retreat was not a rout, but a calculated withdrawal. As the French fell back, Joffre took bold steps to reorganize his forces. He created two new armies. The 6th Army, under Michel-Joseph Monnery, was tasked with defending Paris, while the 9th Army, led by Ferdinand Foch, was positioned between the 3rd and 4th French armies. Using France's extensive rail network, Joffre transferred reinforcements from the Eastern Front and integrated thousands of reserve troops into the fight. The French defences were strengthening, but the Germans had problems of their own. The rapid pace of the German advance had stretched their supply lines to the breaking point. The First Army under Alexander von Kluck had pushed 140 kilometres beyond its main railhead. Their supply convoys, including 60% of their motorised transport, had begun breaking down. Horses were left without fodder, and soldiers, exhausted from weeks of marching and fighting, became gaunt and ragged. Some had marched over 500 kilometres since the campaign began. Casualties were mounting. 20,000 had been killed, wounded, or taken ill. The men had fought hard, but many were beginning to resemble what one officer called living scarecrows. As the German offensive continued, their numbers were also quietly diminishing. Helmuth von Moltke, under pressure to reinforce other fronts, made a fateful decision. He transferred 2 army corps to fight the Russians in the east and reassigned 2 more to besiege Antwerp and Maubeuge. These decisions siphoned away more than 200,000 men from the Western Front. By the time the Germans reached the Marne, their 1st and 2nd armies had been reduced to 372,000 men. Facing them were 980,000 French troops and 100,000 British soldiers. The Germans retained an advantage in artillery, with 3,300 guns to the Allies' 3,000. But sheer numbers were no longer in their favour. By the 2nd of September, cracks were beginning to show in the German war efforts, though neither Helmuth von Moltke nor Alexander von Kluck fully recognised it at the time. Moltke had already realised that his forces were insufficient to execute the original Schlieffen plan, which had envisioned the First Army sweeping west and south around Paris to encircle the French. Adjusting his strategy, he issued a new grand directive. Instead of encircling Paris, the German advance would now bypass the city to the north, attempting to trap the French armies between Paris and Verdun. This shifted the primary offensive role to Karl von Bülow's Second Army, with Kluck's First Army ordered to follow in echelon to protect Bülow's flank. Moltke believed his decision was sound. It was based on intercepted French radio transmissions, indicating that the enemy was retreating across the Marne. But Kluck, known for his boldness, had no patience for a slow, methodical advance. He either misinterpreted or simply ignored the new orders, pushing his troops southward toward the Marne in pursuit of the retreating French Fifth Army. On the 3rd of September, his forces became the first Germans to cross the river, advancing nearly 60 kilometres east of Paris. Confident that the French and British were on the brink of collapse, Kluck gave little thought to the possibility of an organised counterattack. He was unaware that a new French force, the Sixth Army under Joseph Gallieni and Michel-Joseph Montgomery, was already in position to his west. Nor did he pay much attention to the British Expeditionary Force, which had withdrawn from the battlefield days earlier. In Kluck's mind, the battle was all but won, but French commander Joseph Joffre saw things differently. He had spent weeks carefully reinforcing his forces, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had created two new armies, the 6th to guard Paris and the 9th under Ferdinand Foch. And now, on the 3rd of September, he made a decisive move. He dismissed Charles Lanrezac, the commander of the Fifth Army. Lanrezac had been correct in his warnings about the German advance through Belgium, and had defied French military doctrine by adopting a defensive posture to preserve his forces. But Joffre, a firm believer in discipline, removed him nonetheless and replaced him with Louis Franchet d'Espèrey. Meanwhile, the French government was taking no chances. Fearing the imminent fall of Paris, they abandoned the city on the 2nd of September. On the 4th of September, d'Espèrey met with British General Henry Wilson and laid out a daring plan: a counter-offensive against Kluck's First Army. The attack would come from multiple directions: the Fifth Army striking from the south, the British Expeditionary Force pushing from the west, and the Sixth Army advancing towards the Ourcq River. Gallieni had already reached the same conclusion a day earlier, and had sent Montgomery eastward in search of the German flank. That same day, Joffre spent the afternoon in deep contemplation beneath an ash tree, considering the fate of the campaign. That evening he received word of d'Espèrey's plan. He knew it was time to act. That night, he issued a new directive, halting the French retreat and ordering the counterattack to begin on the 6th of September. There was just one problem: the British were under no obligation to follow his orders. Joffre knew that British participation was critical, and he needed to convince John French to stand and fight. At first, he appealed to British diplomatic channels, hoping that London would pressure their commander. When that failed, he took matters into his own hands. On the 5th of September, he travelled to British headquarters in person. The meeting was tense, with French hesitant to commit, but Joffre was not a man to be denied. In a dramatic moment, he slammed his fist on the table and declared, "Monsieur le Maréchal, the honour of England is at stake." It was enough. By the end of the meeting, French had agreed. The attack would begin the next day. At dawn, on the 6th of September, nearly 1 million French soldiers, joined by 100,000 British troops and supported by 3,000 guns, launched a massive counter-offensive against a German force of 750,000 men with 3,300 artillery pieces. The battle stretched from Verdun to Paris. After weeks of retreat, This was the moment that Joseph Joffre had been waiting for. The time for defence was over. The Allies would now strike back. The fighting unfolded across two primary fronts. In the south, the French 5th and 9th Armies clashed with the German 2nd and 3rd. Meanwhile, to the north of the Marne, the newly formed French 6th Army faced off against Kluck's 1st Army. But German coordination was in disarray. With Moltke directing the battle from Luxembourg, hundreds of kilometres away, there was little communication between the German armies. Each would have to fight its own battle. The first engagement took place even before Joffre's offensive formally began. On the 5th of September, northeast of Paris, elements of the French 6th Army encountered a German force under General Hans von Gronow. Gronow, commanding just 24,000 men, faced an overwhelming enemy numbering 150,000. His troops were vastly outnumbered, but he understood the gravity of the situation. If he retreated too quickly, the entire right flank of Kluck's army would be exposed. Instead, he took the fight to the French. Against the odds, his men held them off for an entire day before finally withdrawing. It was enough. Kluck had been warned of the danger to his right flank, and he acted decisively. Rather than continuing southward as planned, he turned his entire army westward to confront Maunery's advancing French 6th Army. This manoeuvre required a complete repositioning of his forces. The men who had already crossed the Marne were forced to march 130 kilometres in just 2 days to face the French head-on. But Kluck's swift and aggressive reaction worked. By the 6th of September, he had stabilised his position, preventing the French from breaking through. Then came one of the most storied moments of the battle. On the night of the 7th, with Kluck's forces pressing hard against Maunery's exhausted men, military governor Joseph Gallieni made a bold decision. He began shuttling reinforcements from Paris to the front using every available means, rail, truck, and in an unprecedented move, the city's taxicabs. In total, 600 Renault taxis were commandeered and sent to the battlefield, ferrying troops 50 kilometres to the front lines. By the next morning, most of the taxis had returned to the city, but the impact of this moment extended far beyond the battlefield. While militarily insignificant in terms of numbers, the sight of Parisian taxis delivering soldiers to the front became an enduring symbol of French resilience. Even as the battle raged, the drivers ran their meters, and later, the French government reimbursed them in full, 70,000 francs. The so-called taxis of the Marne lifted French morale at a critical moment. By the 8th of September, Kluck remained confident. That night, he sent an urgent message to Moltke. The decision will be obtained tomorrow by an enveloping attack by General von Quast. And by morning, it seemed that victory was within reach. Quast's troops had broken through French defences, and the road to Paris lay open just 50 kilometres away. Bülow's 2nd Army, battered and exhausted, had reached its limit. By the 6th of September, after marching more than 440 kilometres since leaving Germany, his forces had been whittled down from 260,000 men to just 154,000. Fatigue, illness, and relentless combat had taken their toll. And now, as Kluck pressed forward in his aggressive push near Paris, Bülow found himself forced into a defensive posture. On the 7th of September, under the pressure of relentless attacks from Franchet d'Esperey's 5th Army, whom the British admiringly nicknamed Desperate Frankie, Bülow ordered his right wing to pull back 15 kilometres to the Petit Morin River. During this retreat, 450 German soldiers attempting to surrender were slaughtered by the advancing French. Meanwhile, rather than retreating entirely, Bülow ordered his left wing to strike back, with the support of Hausen's 3rd Army. Housen's troops launched a daring night assault on the French 9th Army in the marshes of Saint-Gond near Cézanne. With no artillery preparation, his soldiers stormed through enemy lines, overrunning French artillery positions in brutal bayonet combat. The attack pushed the French back 13 kilometres, but the cost was staggering. Exhausted and having suffered 11,000 casualties, Housen's offensive ground to a halt. Meanwhile, an even greater danger was forming in the German lines. Kluck's decision to pivot his army northwest to counter Minory's 6th Army had inadvertently created a massive 50-kilometre gap between his troops and Bülow's 2nd Army. French reconnaissance planes spotted the exposed corridor, and Allied forces seized the opportunity. The British Expeditionary Force pushed northwest toward Kluck, while the French 5th Army struck northeast at Bülow, driving deep into the gap. The French managed to pin Bülow's forces at the Battle of the Two Moraines, named for the twin rivers that cut through the battlefield. Despite the overwhelming numerical advantage of the British in the gap, outnumbering German forces 10-1, their advance was frustratingly slow. On the 6th of September, the British moved so cautiously that they ended the day 12 kilometres behind their objective, suffering only 7 casualties. Over the next 3 days, they advanced just 40 kilometres. The delay infuriated French commanders, particularly Desperay, who needed the British to move faster. Even so, by the 8th of September, French forces had crossed the Petit Morin, forcing Bülow to withdraw his right flank. The next day, the French advanced over the Marne, driving the Germans back even further. At German headquarters in Luxembourg, Helmuth von Moltke had lost control of the battlefield. He relied on couriers rather than telegraph lines, sending Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch on what would become one of the most consequential staff missions in military history. On the 8th of September, Hensch arrived at the headquarters of the German 5th, 4th and 3rd Armies, where he found the situation still favourable. But when he reached Bülow's headquarters that evening, he was given a far grimmer report. Bülow described his army as cinders, incapable of further offence. His right flank was collapsing, and the only way to salvage the situation, he argued, was for Kluck to immediately abandon his battle with the French 6th Army and fall back to close the gap. If not, disaster was imminent. Hensch, operating on vague verbal orders from Moltke, asserted that he had full authority to command a retreat. During the meeting, news arrived that Bülow's forces were buckling under the pressure of French and British attacks. Bülow ordered his army to withdraw 20 kilometres, warning of incalculable consequences if the situation worsened. Hensch agreed if the Allies crossed the Marne, a full-scale German retreat would be necessary. On the morning of the 9th of September, without waiting to see what Kluck would do, Bülow ordered another withdrawal. Hensch pressed forward, reaching Kluck's headquarters near the Ork River at 11:30 am. The devastation of war was everywhere. When he finally met with Kluck's chief of staff, Hermann von Kuhl, he delivered a stunning order. The First Army must retreat. Kuhl was dumbfounded. The First Army was poised to strike toward Paris. Victory seemed within reach. But Hensch was adamant. Bülow was already withdrawing, and if Kluck did not do the same, the entire German front could collapse. Reluctantly, Kluck issued the retreat order, claiming that he was doing so at the behest of Moltke's general staff. 2 days later, on the 11th of September, Moltke himself visited the front lines and ordered a general retreat. The entire German advance was collapsing. Over the next few days, they fell back 65 kilometres to the Aisne River, where they would dig in and prepare for a new phase of the war. For the German soldiers who had marched for weeks through Belgium and France, fought brutal battles, and suffered casualties, the retreat was crushing. They had pushed to the very doorstep of Paris, believing victory was imminent. And now they were ordered to give it all up. Across nearly 400 kilometers of front line, German troops turned around and retraced the steps they had fought so hard to gain. The First Battle of the Marne, the battle that saved Paris, was not decided by sheer force of arms. It was decided by a single moment, by one side's decision not to fight. The German retreat between the 9th and 13th of September marked the collapse of the Schlieffen Plan. It was a devastating blow. In its aftermath, Helmuth von Moltke is said to have confided to Kaiser Wilhelm II, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." Whether he truly uttered these words remains uncertain, but his own letters reveal a grim realization. On the night of the 9th, he wrote to his wife, "Things have not gone well. The fighting east of Paris has not gone in our favour, and we shall have to pay for the damage we have done." By the 14th of September, it was clear that Moltke was no longer in control. His nervous exhaustion had crippled his ability to command. German military officials informed the Kaiser that Moltke's condition was beyond repair, and he was forced to resign. War Minister Erich von Falkenhayn was appointed to replace him. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, German forces continued their retreat for as much as 90 kilometers, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and hundreds of captured weapons in the hands of the Allies. 11,000 German soldiers were taken by the French, along with 30 field guns and 100 machine guns. Another 3,500 Germans were captured by the British. The retreat dashed Germany's hopes of pushing beyond the Verdun-Marne-Paris line and securing a swift victory. Now the war had entered a new, grinding phase. With the failure of both sides to outflank the other during the race to the sea, the era of rapid movement ended. In its place, a brutal, stagnant front line took shape, an unbroken wall of trenches and defences that would hold for nearly 4 years. At the start of the war, both the Germans and the Allies had envisioned a short, decisive conflict. But despite the German invasion's failure to deliver a knockout blow, the situation still favoured the Central Powers. The German army occupied vast swathes of northern France and nearly all of Belgium. France had lost 64% of its iron production, 62% of its steel, and half of its coal resources. The disastrous failure of France's Plan 17 had directly contributed to this staggering loss. Yet if Germany had gained ground, it had not gained victory. The credit for halting their advance rested largely on Joseph Joffre, who transformed a desperate retreat into a counteroffensive. He exploited interior lines to move troops rapidly, dismissed generals who failed him, and repositioned forces to strike at the crucial moment. By the time the battle reached its climax, the German First Army faced 191 battalions of French and British troops, while the German Second and Third Armies were opposed by 268 battalions of fresh French reinforcements. Joffre's ruthless efficiency held the line. Even so, it was Desperat who devised the bold counterattack plan. In his memoirs, Joffre later admitted it was he who made the Battle of the Marne possible. Historians remain divided on how to characterise the battle. It was, by all accounts, a partial success. British historian John Terraine remarked that it never presented the traditional aspect of victory. Yet, the Franco-British breakthrough into the gap between the First and Second German armies, he argued, made it the decisive battle of the war. Other scholars, including Barbara Tuchman and Robert Doughty, viewed it as an incomplete victory. The opportunity for a definitive, crushing blow had slipped through Joffre's hands. Kluck himself, when reflecting on the battle, pointed to one factor above all others: the resilience of the French soldier. That men will let themselves be killed where they stand, that is well known and counted on in every plan of battle, he wrote. but that men who have retreated for 10 days, sleeping on the ground and half dead with fatigue, should be able to take up their rifles and attack when the bugle sounds. That is a thing upon which we never counted. It was a possibility not studied in our war academy. For Germany, the true cost of the Battle of the Marne was not just in casualties, but in its long-term strategic consequences. Military historian Richard Brooks noted that its most significant outcome was the collapse of the Schlieffen Plan, forcing Germany into the one scenario it had feared most: a prolonged two-front war. This was a war it had sought to avoid at all costs, one that would stretch its resources to the breaking point. The Battle of the Marne was also a testament to a new kind of warfare. For the first time in history, aerial reconnaissance played a decisive role, spotting weaknesses in the German lines that the Allies exploited. The battlefield was changing, the tools of war were evolving. But as the lines hardened and the trenches deepened, one thing was certain: this war, which so many had expected to be swift, was only just beginning. The scale of destruction at the Battle of the Marne was staggering. Over 2 million men fought along the Marne front in early September, and while exact figures remain elusive, estimates suggest that around 500,000 men were killed or wounded during the battle. French casualties alone reached 250,000, with approximately 80,000 men killed. Historian Barbara Tuchman recorded French losses in August at over 206,000, while other estimates placed total French casualties from August and September just under 420,000. These staggering numbers highlight the sheer cost of the early months of the war. On the German side, losses were similarly devastating. Estimates for the entire Western Front in 1914 suggest that 500,000 German soldiers were lost in the opening campaigns. Specific figures from German medical reports detail the cost of the Marne itself: 13,000 casualties for the First Army, 10,000 for the Second, nearly 15,000 for the Third, over 9,000 for the Fourth, more than 19,000 for the Fifth, over 21,000 for the Sixth, and just above 10,000 for the Seventh. The total number of German casualties along the Marne front is estimated to have been at least 67,000. For the British Expeditionary Force, the cost was lower but still significant. Official reports counted around 13,000 casualties, including nearly 1,700 killed. In total, some historians estimate that the combined casualties on both sides exceeded 300,000 men. Others argue that isolating the losses at the Marne from the greater campaign of the Western Front is difficult, as the battle was part of a larger struggle that had begun in August and would continue to grind forward in the months that followed. Beyond the raw numbers, the battle also claimed the lives of notable figures. Among them was Charles Péguy, the French poet and philosopher, who led his men into combat at the battle's outset and was struck down while charging forward with his platoon. His death was a tragic symbol of the war's relentless devastation. With the German retreat from the Marne, the Allies pressed forward, gathering prisoners, weapons, and abandoned supplies as they pursued the retreating enemy. By September 10th, Joffre ordered a full advance, but the Germans managed to slip away, ending their withdrawal on high ground along the north bank of the Aisne River. There, they began to dig in. From September 13th onward, the Allies launched repeated attacks against the German positions, but the high ground and well-prepared defences made any progress costly and slow. As French and British forces battered the entrenched enemy, it became clear that frontal assaults would not dislodge them. Joffre pivoted, shifting the Second Army to the western flank, beginning what would later be known as the Race to the Sea. Both sides now recognised the strategic importance of securing the northernmost flank. Beginning in mid-September, The French moved fresh reinforcements westward, utilising their well-maintained rail network to shift entire corps in just a few days. At the same time, Germany was reinforcing its own right flank, sending troops from Belgium and other sectors of the front to shore up their defensive lines. Each side sought to outmaneuver the other, probing for an open flank that no longer existed. By early October, these manoeuvring attempts solidified into brutal engagements across northern France and Belgium. The French and British launched attacks in Picardy and Artois, hoping to outflank the Germans, but instead met stiff resistance. The Germans too attempted to push through at Arras, La Bassée and Messines, but the Allies held firm. By the middle of October, the northern flank had fully solidified. With the once mobile war grinding to a halt, the final German push came in the battles of Ypres and Ypres, where the German 4th and 6th armies attempted to break through. The battles raged from mid-October to late November, but despite their relentless offensives, the Germans could only capture small sections of ground. The race to outflank one another had failed. As the winter rains set in, the exhausted armies now faced each other from long lines of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The war of movement had ended. The war of attrition had begun. The Battle of the Marne had saved France, but at an immense cost. It had shattered the German dream of a quick victory, forcing them into a long and grueling conflict that neither side had anticipated. The trenches of the Western Front would remain nearly unchanged for the next 4 years, defining the brutal nature of the First World War. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. The Battle of the Marne was a turning point in the First World War, a moment where the course of the conflict shifted, shaping the years of struggle that followed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more ASMR war history. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And as always, sleep well, my friends.